Hello, I'm Mike Schroeder. I'm not a botanist, but I am someone with a passion for native plants and their importance in our ecosystem. And today we are located on the south side of the South Pasture at Betty's Neck in Lakeville. And today I'm going to introduce you to some of the trees and shrubs that grow along this stretch. Now, one of the nice things about walking along this southern edge, or any edge of the pasture, is the trees have a lot of branches that are low down, so we can see the leaves and the buds and the fruit more closely. All right, the first one we're going to talk about is black cherry. This is a tree that's often rejected as a landscape tree because it's so subject to insect attack and diseases. Well, because it matures so early, the diseases never wipe out the species. It matures early, produces fruit, and reproduces itself like crazy. As far as the insect attack, well, all those insects support bird life. So we should not be too critical of this tree and all of its caterpillars that it supports. It is very significant for birds. One of the things that bird life get from this tree, and you can taste them also because they are not poisonous, they're a little bittersweet. But this is a cluster of their berries. This was a little stalk of white flowers earlier in the spring, and now we have the black berries. They are a cherry, so there's a very large pit inside. Now, how to know if it is indeed a black cherry? Well, if we take a closer look, you can see the shape of the leaf, sort of almond-shaped. It has speckles on the twigs. The bark itself, we don't have any bark that really is very characteristic because we have kind of a scruffy growth at the side of the pasture here. But the bark will be has rings that go around it. It's very dark, and often it peels off, and children have said it looks like burnt potato chips. Another way to tell that this is black cherry, if you think the leaf looks right and the bark looks right, if you scrape the bark, scrape the twig just a little bit and sniff it, it smells, well, it's a nasty smell, kind of like somebody put water in an ashtray full of cigarette butts. Anyway, that's black cherry for you. Before we begin to talk about the tree right here, which is a black or sweet birch, I want to go back for just a minute to the cherry and say, I mentioned the fruit is edible. Eating fruit in the wild can be very dangerous. So you want to make absolutely sure that you know what you are touching. The best thing to do is just to say no, particularly to tell your children to say, just don't try it. I'm an adult. I can take my own risks, but I don't recommend it for you. All right, now, the tree that we have right here is sweet or black birch, as I mentioned, called sweet birch because it has the most amazing fragrance. If you scratch the bark, you get the fragrance of wintergreen. And that very wintergreen is an indication that this tree has in it a substance called acetosalicylic acid, I hope I'm saying that right, which is the same substance as in aspirin. And an extract from this tree was used by Native Americans to help with mild pain relieving. Now let's talk about how to identify this tree. If we could zoom in a little bit on these leaves, I'll show you some things about the nature of its leaf. Here's a really good branch right here that we could zoom in on. Can we do that? The leaf is oddly sticky, for one thing. There's some kind of resin in it that does make it stick to your hands. And if you sniff your fingers after handling it, you get a little bit of that wintergreen smell. Sometimes the leaves grow in little pairs like that, sometimes they don't. But they tend to grow, except where they're growing in pairs, they tend to grow off opposite sides of the branch. The leaf has teeth on it, but it's very, very flexible feeling. It's not, we're going to be talking about beech later, and I'll tell you a little bit about the difference with that one. Okay, now one of the characteristics of this tree is the way in which it produces its seeds. In the springtime, it has catkins that hang down. that are will be wind pollinated, and then there are also those would be the male catkins that scatter pollen, and the female catkins, which are mostly located on higher branches, but here we have some on lower branches, and they will produce little tiny seeds that will break apart and blow around. I would like to note that these seeds are, besides producing new black or sweet birch, they also are seed for food for small birds. All right, the next tree we're going to talk about is one that sometimes you might confuse with the black birch, and this is the American beech. Its leaf has a somewhat similar shape, but a very different feel to it. It's almost paper-like in its consistency. Sometimes children refer to it as the money tree. Right now it is a very dark green. As fall comes in, the leaves will turn very yellow, and in young trees those leaves will last like late into the fall, so you'll find them throughout the woods looking very honey-colored. Beech tree has also a very smooth bark. This time of year it's very difficult to see the bark, so maybe we'll do that for another program. Beech tree has a tendency to grow in a whole colony. It suckers, and so you will have a whole huge forest patch that's nothing but beech trees, suppressing the rest of the growth underneath. In this case, it is just part of a very diverse collection of trees. One of its characteristics, which you can tell in the wintertime, but also at this time of year, it has a very long bud for its new leaves for next year, a long pointed bud, and that is very characteristic of beech. Its bark is speckled like the black birch was, but a little darker and a little shinier, and there's no fragrance to it. It is a nut-producing tree, and we are lucky enough to have just a few fruits available on this tree. Here is one right here. If we could zoom in on this, you could see the nut is inside that green husk. It hasn't ripened yet. It will get a little bit bigger than that. The nuts are an important food for all kinds of mammals, for all kinds of... The nut is a very important food for all kinds of mammals as well as birds. And of course it is when it produces a lot of them, some of them will survive to produce new beech trees. All right, tucked in between two of the black birch, we have white pine and blueberry, high bush blueberry tucked in here. Yes, blueberry. The white pine is fairly small at this stage. It's a very young one. It's going to get to be a lot taller. Now, white pine isn't the only pine we have in this area, but it is our most common and our sturdiest. We also have pitch pine, which doesn't reproduce very well unless the area where it grows burns, which we no longer allow to happen. White pine has very, very soft needles, whereas the pitch pine ones are coarser. And white pine also has needles in clusters. Each cluster has 5 needles. The word white has 5 letters, and that's one way to remember that. It puts out a new set of growth every year, so you can count back to the bottom of the tree to figure out how many years old it is. 5 years to really show anything, and then every ring of growth is another year that the tree has lived. And right underneath it is a little high bush blueberry trying to get itself up there. Because it is in so much shade, it may never produce fruit. But if something happened to the trees behind us, it would break out in glorious blueberries. Then right at the base of it, a tiny little thing, but possibly a 30, 40-foot tree someday. It is the American holly, which I think most of you will recognize, a shiny leaf, evergreen, with the sharp points. It too is a fruit producer, but only if this one is a female holly will it have the fruit. And there's no way to tell at this stage of its life. All right, I wanted to stop at this particular location because sometimes nature is our best guide for landscaping. Notice the texture of the white pine and the American beech in the background. And then this lovely little thing right here. This is what we're mainly going to talk about here. This is a shrub called huckleberry. In the blueberry, closely related to blueberry, but its berry is a darker blue, and it doesn't have a little crown on it that blueberries have. It also, it's a little bit different in that its twig is brown rather than, or gray, rather than green, the way that the twigs on all the different blueberries are. It grows as a colony. So all of this in here may be all one plant, because it just keeps sending up roots to go further and further to spread itself out. One of the characteristics of huckleberry is that the underside of the leaf is what we refer to as being resinous. If you look at it really closely or look at it with a lens, you will see that the underside of the leaf, I think this is much too much for us to try to see with the camera, but you will see little tiny resin dots on the bottom of it. In the sunlight, sometimes they shine almost gold, and sometimes the leaves are very sticky, particularly the underside. I can't get this one to do it, but sometimes they will stick to your finger. Now, something I wanted to mention, as we go along today, we're going to notice a lot of little brown places on the leaves. So things look, a lot of the leaves are going to look very eaten and diseased. Well, just remember, it's August. These plants have been doing their thing for months now, and they're just about to give up. So you're going to be seeing a lot of the insect damage. After all, they're supporting all that insect life, which is supporting all that bird life. So don't be too critical when things look a little beat up and battered this time of year. All right, at this location, we have several things to talk about. First of all, I wanted to point out about this tree, shrub. I guess we could refer to it as a tree. A tree usually has one trunk, shrubs have many, but this is I refer to it as a cedar, red cedar, but it's in the juniper family. It is really not a cedar at all. It is a very sun-dependent tree, so this one may not continue to do very well because it is on the wrong side of the pasture. We don't know if it's going to have berries. I don't see any on it at all, which may indicate that it is a male. It is one of those shrubs and trees that only bears the fruit on a female and the pollen on a male. So unless we looked at this in the spring when it has the pollen or seed-producing flowers, we can't tell for sure. It will be evergreen, so you will see this one with its needles all winter long. Beside it, we have a species of oak. If you'll notice, the leaves all have little bristles at the end. Most everybody recognizes that traditional oak shape, but there are subtle differences. When they have the points on them like this, that means that they belong to the group of oaks that is called the black oak group. In that group, you have black oak, red oak, and scarlet oak around here, as well as some other species further down toward the Cape. Sometimes it's difficult to tell the difference between a black or a red or a scarlet oak because they hybridize. I am thinking that this one is a red oak, but it could be a black oak. You would have to look at the acorns, at the bark, and even then, you might not be able to tell the difference. We refer to the little cutouts on the leaf as the sinuses, and the parts that have the bristles on them, those are the lobes of the leaf. So this is, this one does not have very deep sinuses, so I am guessing that it is a red oak, but I can't be absolutely certain. Next, over here, we have another oak that has much deeper sinuses, and its buds are just a little bit different color. So I am guessing that this one is a scarlet oak, but we know for sure that both of these, even though they have leaves that look very different in some ways, that both of them are in that red and black oak group. The other oak group, we'll find some samples of a little bit later. They have rounded lobes and they don't have the bristle. Now, the interesting thing about anything in the black oak group is their acorns take 2 years to develop, and they are very, very bitter with a lot of tannic acid in them. We all know squirrels like to eat acorns, but they don't particularly like to eat the black oak acorns the first year. Those are the ones that, if they bury them, that tannic acid leaches out, and then they taste better the next year if they don't sprout and grow into a tree before they're found. The white oak acorn is much sweeter to the squirrels, and so they sprout much more quickly. The white oak acorns have only taken 1 year to form, so they haven't gotten quite as much tannic acid in them. The oak trees are considered one of the most significant trees in our ecosystem. People stopped planting them for a little while because they were worried about all the caterpillar attacks, but right now our oaks are in very good shape. We haven't had a caterpillar attack for a couple of years. They're a very resilient tree, but they are the ones that support the most insect life and therefore the most bird life. So by all means, don't hesitate to plant a native oak tree in your yard. This is further discussion of the oak. When you come upon oak trees, you're very often going to see odd little growths on them like this, little knobs like that. Sometimes there will be little round balls that are coming out of a twig or a leaf. Can you see this right here? Right there. Mm-hmm. This is a place where an insect has laid its egg, and through some trick of the transferring DNA, it has persuaded the leaf, the tree, to make a home for its babies, because the insect's offspring will grow up inside of that little growth. Now, we don't know what kind of an insect this is. There's quite a study of galls. There are many different types. But oak trees always have a lot of them, and they're kind of fun to see. Unless there is a huge outbreak of them, they don't seem to do any damage to the trees. You'll just have a few leaves with little nodules on them, kind of like we all have moles. But our moles don't produce anything, thank goodness. I wanted you to have a quick look at the canopy of the trees. That's going to be the top layer of trees. And wanted to point out to you that almost all of what we see as the canopy trees are indeed oak trees. And these are either black or red. You'll know, even from a distance, you can see the little bristles at the end of the lobes of the leaves. All right, what I have my hand on right here is a hickory, a pignut hickory. We find along this edge quite a lot of very small hickories. Eventually, they may become canopy trees and be up high. We haven't been looking up at the top of the trees as we've gone along, because most of the trees we're seeing at the edge are very young trees and may or may not get up to the canopy. But we're finding quite a lot of hickory, and something that I've observed recently is that hickory is something that has always been here, but seems to be really having a surge of growth in the last several years. And that could be because we had such an attack on our red maples and on our oak trees, and the hickory trees were not bothered by that. So they may have been filling in a little bit more, but they haven't had a chance to get very large, many of them. So there's some, mama tree is in here someplace, but the ones that we're seeing are the small ones that have been able to get themselves started at the edge. How big they'll get to be? Well, if they could overcome the oak that is shadowing them, they could get to be, as 80 feet tall. How do you recognize a hickory tree? Well, a hickory tree is a tree with compound leaves. It means that out of these buds, and can you zoom in on this so we can actually see this bud? I'm going to break a little leaf off to see. The buds on a hickory tree are extremely large, and out of that bud comes not just one entire or lobed leaf. What you get is a compound leaf, which means several leaflets. When the leaves are dropped in the fall, I'm going to break one of these off, sorry tree, just to let you know, that is one leaf. And these are referred to as leaflets. In this case, there are 5 leaflets, and that's pretty typical of a hickory. An ash tree also has leaflets like this, but with a hickory tree, the leaves come out, instead of opposite each other, the leaves come out like just alternating down the branch. So we've heard of it as alternate branching. So that's an indication that it is a hickory and not an ash tree. Hickory does produce a nut, and like the beech tree, it is a very significant food for all kinds of critters, very much so mammals, but also some birds will eat a hickory nut. Maybe later on we'll find a hickory nut. One of the things that we're going to find growing along here that is a woody growth, not a shrub or a tree, are the vines. And this is one of the vines that is native and can be very problematic if you're trying to garden with it around. But in nature, it definitely has its role. This is catbrier. The spines help it to protect it from things munching on it and also aid it in climbing. It will climb up quite high in the trees, and when it gets way up, it will produce berries, or even the berries will be down low if it gets enough sun. But it is one of the strategies of survival for this particular plant. It climbs. While you may not like to have to walk through it or work through it, it does provide a lot of shelter for both birds. A bird hiding in a clump of catbrier is protected somewhat from predation from a hawk, or a little rabbit that that burrows underneath it will be somewhat protected from predation from a fox or other critter. So it does produce berries, both flowers and berries. So it has a lot of merits, and we should give it some respect, even if we get annoyed with it. All right, the little tree right here, whose life is just beginning, is another one of our oaks. This is a part of the white oak group. If you will notice, there are no bristles at the end of the lobes. Rather, they are rounded. So this is a white oak, lobed, but no bristles. It's very pale underneath, which may indicate that it is a swamp white, which you would not expect to find here. But occasionally a swamp white has a seed that's dropped in the wrong place. If it's a swamp white, it's probably never going to do very well because it's not moist enough here. If it is a regular white oak, it could get to be a canopy tree, just like the ones that we were looking at. If it gets to be a really huge tree, it will produce those acorns in 1 year and will provide a lot of food. Some oaks have what is called a mast year, which means that there are years when they produce a lot of seed, a lot of acorns. And then there'll be years when they don't. Because they vary this from year to year, it means that the population of critters that eat the acorns will have a lot of food the year that there's a mast year, but there'll be some left over to grow. The years when they don't produce very many, all the acorns are going to be eaten and there's no reproduction. So we don't know the future of this oak tree. We're going to go and take a look now at a larger white oak tree and see how it's doing. All right, here we have another white oak. Lobes are rounded, no bristles. This one is one that has lived a much longer time. It's gotten to be much taller. Its leaves are very deeply cut, which is not necessarily the case for most white oaks. It could be that this is because it is indeed a swamp oak as opposed to being the regular white oak. In any case, you have a chance to see its height. Even a swamp oak gets to be quite tall. Typical of white oak bark is very difficult to see with this tree. It is maybe a topic for another show, but I will say that white oak tends to have a very pale bark that then gets very flaky up the top of the tree. You can almost see that in this one. All right, you can see that this white oak has gotten to be, like maybe 30, 40 feet, but up above it you've got, overshadowing it, you have members of the black oak group that are dominating. So this tree may not be able to may not be able to overcome that competition for sunlight. All right, in this little group here, we have a number of things that we've already talked about. Little beginnings of trees that maybe are going to make it and maybe aren't. They're just little seedlings. We have one that we have not talked about, and that's a poplar. This is a, well, I should say, populus. Some people use the common name aspen. They may say big-toothed aspen or a big-leafed aspen. Big-leafed poplar, big-toothed poplar. But in any case, this is a member of the poplar family, and it is probably going to do pretty well here. It's kind of out at the edge, and if it's allowed to grow, it can be quite a canopy tree. One of the characteristics of a poplar tree that's kind of fun is that the leaves tend to be flattened at the base. So when the wind blows, they rattle and make a very distinctive sound, even when they're quite tall. But the shape, just a quick review of the shape. It's not exactly a heart-shaped leaf, but this is typical of the shape. Large leaf because it's a big tooth poplar. A very large, tends to have a fairly large bud. They grow alternate along the twig. You don't find leaves opposite each other. They skip a little space before the leaf on the other side begins. So that is a poplar tree. A poplar tree grows very fast and tends to have a fairly short life, and reproduces itself at a young age. So lots of poplars around. There's something else in here that may threaten the life of this tree, though, and that's one of our non-native vines, which is a serious problem, especially in the Lakeville area, and that is bittersweet. If you can see in the back, this round leaf, almost round, and the berries right now are a sort of a yellowish color, but they're going to turn yellow and orange. People think they're beautiful, and this is kind of what had happened. People collected the berries and then tossed them out into the woods and spread them. This is Oriental bittersweet. There is a native bittersweet, which has become quite rare. This is the Oriental one, though, that is really a threat to our woodland edges and even our deep woods. The reason it is such a serious threat is because it not only climbs the way that catbrier does, it wraps around and almost like a boa constrictor. The vine gets thicker and thicker, and the tree tries to grow, and it can't grow, and so eventually the tree is choked to death. Any vine can be too much weight on the tree and break it down, but bittersweet adds the choking to that aspect of its threat to trees. So learn to recognize it, pull it out whenever you see it. A further comment about the bittersweet: when you're trying to get rid of it, when you try to pull it out, if you get resistance and you're not getting the whole root, it's going to come back again. You've got to get the whole root out. If you are unable to get that whole root out, you will see more bittersweet. My technique is to use a concentrated herbicide designed for woody growth and just paint the cut surface of when I cut that root that I can't get out. If you don't like herbicide, then you'll just have to keep pulling and pulling and digging and digging. So good luck getting rid of it.